Today I'm going to be reviewing the Intel Core i5-12600K. It's a $320 CPU, 10 cores, 16 threads with 6 P cores and 4 E cores. And it's actually been about 2 weeks since Intel launched this platform, the LGA 1700 motherboards with the Z690 chipset and 3 CPUs in the stack so far, with more promised in early 2022. My benchmarks video on the Core i9-12900K, the flagship on this platform, has already been up since launch date, but today I would like to address some of the questions and follow-ups that were requested in that video. One was that this platform can support both DDR4 and DDR5 memory and a comparison between the two of those. And second was the idea of the overall platform cost, because if you're investing in a 12th gen Intel Core processor, you're going to need a new motherboard, a new CPU of course, and then you need to make the decision, should I get DDR4 or DDR5? Is there a price difference between the two of those? Is there a performance difference between the two of those? And most importantly, how much is it? Today, we're going to find out.
Excellent!
Today's video is brought to you by MSI Z690 motherboards built for 12th generation Intel Core processors. Whether you prefer the blacked out look of the MEG Z690 Unify, the dazzling RGB capabilities of the MPG Z690 Carbon Wi-Fi, or the well-balanced form and function provided by the MAG Z690 Tomahawk Wi-Fi, every board is packed with features like 2.5 gig LAN, 20 gigabit USB 3.2, up to 5 M.2 NVMe SSD slots, premium VRM cooling, and of course, PCI Express Gen 5 support, as well as Wi-Fi 6E and DDR5 memory slots on specified models. Click the sponsor link in the description for more on the Z690 motherboard lineup from MSI. So one of the nicest things about the 12600K is that you can actually buy it, and you can still actually buy it even a couple weeks after launch. Here's a listing on NEWEGG where it's selling for $320, which is the same price that it was up for on launch day. Now there's also a 12600KF which doesn't have an integrated graphics. That's currently out of stock and very difficult to find. This one might potentially be available for $300, so if you don't need an iGPU and you can find this, you might be able to save yourself 20 bucks or so. And while you can't buy it directly from Amazon right now, the resellers are still only selling it for a few bucks more than $320, so it seems like the 12600K is readily available. But as mentioned in the intro, the focus here is on platform costs, so I'm going to be focusing on the most core components, the CPU, the motherboard, and the memory. Everything else is flexible or variable to some degree, so whether or not you have a graphics card, whether or not you have a case, whether or not you want to go with a $200 cooler or a $50 cooler, that is all up to you. But these core components you must have in some way, shape, or form. So here we have 3 columns in my little Google Docs spreadsheet that I put together. On the left we have an AMD X570 or B550 setup with the 5600X. In the middle we have an Intel Z690 setup with a 12600. I put K or KF, but like I already said, the KFs are pretty hard to find right now, so I just went with the K, and that's using DDR4 memory. And then we have the Intel Z690 setup with DDR5 memory. So the CPU for the 5600X is going to cost you 300 bucks. That's the retail price right now. It went up to 310, but it's back to 300. And then there's the 12600K or KF, which we're going with $320 for the price. Like I said, the KF you can get for 300, but you really can't right now, so we're going with 320. For the memory, we have a 32 gig kit for a couple reasons. One is that that's what I used in my initial testing, so for cross comparison, it made sense to continue with a 32 gig 3600 kit. But also for DDR4 at least, you can find these for pretty reasonable prices, even if you're looking for decent CAS latency and higher capacity, like 32 gigs, 2x16. Jumping over to PC Part Picker for DDR4, 3600 speed memory in this capacity, you can find them for as low as about $105 to $110. That's for CAS latency 18. A bit more ideal would be CAS latency 16, and that is what I used for my benchmark testing. The price jumps up by about $40 to $50 to about $155. This G-Skill kit, the specific RipJaws 5 kit isn't what I use, but the memory itself and the timings is exactly what I use for benchmark testing. So there we have a price range of $105 to $160, and use the same kit for both of these test bed setups. Yes, indeed, DDR5 is a challenge right now. Even for the most base level kit without even any heat spreaders on it, you're looking at $137. That's for a 16 gig kit. Not 32 gigs, 16 gigs. $30 premium on top of that if you want these alloy blades that have heat spreaders. And then beyond that, if you jump up to 32 gigs, minimum of $274, goes up to $280 pretty quickly. And this is DDR5 4800, which is the slowest DDR5 memory that's available. There are some 5200 kits for around $280, but like I said, all of these are sold out. There actually were a couple kits in stock earlier today, but they irritated me because it was a marketplace seller who was trying to sell them for $1,100 to $1,300 for a 32 gig kit. So I tweeted about it, and now they're not there anymore. And Yeah, I think that's because of me. Point is though, if you want a 32 gig reasonable speed DDR5 kit, you're gonna be spending a lot of money and you probably can't even buy it straight up right now anyway. So $280 to $350 is the price range for that. And then of course you need a motherboard. And here I think, apart from CPU performance, is a place where AMD still has a clear advantage because they have a full lineup of motherboards available. They have both B550 and X570 motherboards. B550 motherboards are also completely unlocked for overclocking. So that's a totally reasonable choice. And while I wouldn't necessarily recommend some of these super budget options that are in the like $60 to $80 range, they start to get pretty reasonable and pretty well featured, even around like 110 to 120. So something like the Asus Prime B550 Plus or the Gigabyte B550 Gaming X, perfectly adequate motherboards that you can buy right now that aren't crazy expensive, and that will seriously reduce your total platform cost if you're looking at more reasonably priced motherboards. So I put $120 to $200 for that price range. And that's because if you are looking at something like X570, again, you do have budget options in the $150, $160, $170 range. But again, pretty quickly you get into some healthy options like the Tough Gaming X570 Pro, which is a really solid board from Asus. And you can currently find that one for $187, though it usually goes for a little over $200. By comparison, if you want an LGA 1700 motherboard for the new Intel 12th gen processors and you want DDR5 support, the least expensive one on Newegg, at least right now, is $230. It's this MSI board right here, which I don't have hands-on experience with, but at first glance, it looks perfectly adequate to me. But if you switch over to DDR4 as the standard, then you get, oh wait, where did it go? Where did it go? It's out of stock, isn't it? You get this one, and this is the one I bought, and now it's out of stock, so that's unfortunate. Anyway, it's 200 bucks. The Wi-Fi version of it is $220. It is the Gigabyte Z690 UD DDR4, and this is the motherboard that I ran all of my DDR4 tests with. So all that is to say, a reasonable baseline Z690 motherboard with DDR4 support, $200, and if you bump that up to DDR5, even the motherboard is going to cost you a little bit more, at least with what's currently available. That gives you a low-end price on the AMD side of $525 with a high end of $660. Z690 plus DDR4, the low end is $625, but do bear in mind that $80 of that is the motherboard cost and the other $20 is the CPU cost. And on the high end, it creeps up to $680 if you're going with a higher speed memory kit, and that is really comparable to what you can get on the AMD side. However, if you want DDR5, and this is mainly the cost of the memory, but also a little bit the cost of the motherboard, you're looking at $830 to $900, and that's a pretty significant bump up over either of these other two options. It's also worth noting that the 5600X includes a box cooler. It's not the greatest box cooler. It could get you by for a while. If you're going to overclock and do stuff like that, then you probably want to switch away from it. But if you're looking at total system cost and you're not just considering the prices of these core components, that might be a contributing factor as well. So those are the dollar amounts you should be keeping in mind if you're considering the platform cost of upgrading to either of these platforms if you're building from scratch. From there, we can move into some actual performance benchmarks. If you watched my 12900K review, I will be using much of the same testing hardware, as well as Windows 11 with all the latest drivers, updates, and patches. And this is a key point, I enabled multi-core enhancement and adaptive boost for Intel platforms and precision boost overdrive and auto OC for AMD. And what I didn't consider at first is that MCE can work differently on different motherboards. So while my DDR5 tests were stable and consistent with MCE enabled on the Asus Maximus Z690 Hero that I used in my 12900K review, the new Gigabyte Z690 UD DDR4 board's MCE configuration was much more aggressive and definitely set a higher CPU power limit while running all cores at 4.9 GHz. So my first run of DDR4 tests with the 12600K beat most of the DDR5 results that I had by a pretty healthy margin, prompting me to rerun them with MCE turned off, which is more of a stock 12600K configuration with only XMP enabled. So what you'll see in the benchmarks is 3 entries for the 12600K, with DDR5 and MCE, with DDR4 and MCE, and with DDR4 and MCE disabled. The Gigabyte Z690 UD DDR4 motherboard itself did just fine in testing, apart from those aggressive MCE settings, which didn't hurt performance, but did cause greatly increased power draw and temps, as we'll see in just a moment. It doesn't have many bells and whistles like a surface-mounted power button, although it does have one of those for reset, which is odd, and it has what I'm calling the first budget fixed I/O shield that I've ever seen. It's fixed, but but it's also the bare metal variety that I usually associate with lower-end boards. Functionally, it's got everything you'd want though, including a front panel USB 3.2 Gen 2 Type-C header, Q-Flash Plus for BIOS updates, some RGB LED headers, 3 M.2 slots, and even a PS2 header for anyone with a 20-year-old mouse or keyboard. Oh, and there's no RGB lighting on the board itself. The Aorus logo there is built-in lighting for the M.2 SSD that I used. For all 4 test beds that I set up, I used these parts for consistency. The power supply was a Corsair AX1600i 80+ titanium unit, the GPU was an NVIDIA RTX 3090 Founders Edition, and the CPU cooler was the 360mm Corsair H150i Elite LCD with fans set to 90% and the AIO positioned to push air across the motherboard VRMs for consistency. The remaining setup details can be seen here if you're interested. And now let's go over performance. Here are the speeds each CPU was running at. I'm showing the peak frequency each CPU hit across all tests, the average frequency during moderate use, and the sustained all-core frequency under a heavy synthetic load with the IDA64 stress test. Gigabyte's MCE settings kept all CPU cores pegged at 4.9 GHz for the 12600K, with the DDR5 and non-MCE setups sitting at 4.5 GHz all-core. Since we are within thermal limits, which we'll look at momentarily, a 1 or 2 core overclock to 5.1 or 5.2 GHz would likely equalize the 12600K and 12900K in terms of single core performance. The 12600K's 4 efficiency cores were also running at full load during the IDA64 test, running at 3.4 GHz all-core stock, 3.6 GHz with the DDR5 setup, and 3.7 GHz with Gigabyte's MCE settings on the DDR4 testbed. Here are my thermal comparisons showing the average and peak temperatures after a 10-minute IDA64 stress test, and immediately we can see the results of the DDR4 testbed's aggressive MCE tuning. 62C average and 79C max are closer to the 12900K's temps than the 12600's stock temps, and remember, this is using a high-end 360mm all-in-one liquid cooler that retails for over $200 right now. The stock DDR4 and MCE DDR5 results are much more reasonable, with stock looking downright chilly at 49C average and 62C peak. For power draw, I'm showing 3 values: the peak CPU package power as reported by Hardware Info, and measuring the wattage drawn by the entire system to show an average during the Blender BMW render and peak overall system draw during CPU-only testing. Apart from the DDR4 MCE tests, the 12600K's power draw looks much more reasonable versus the 5600X here, only pulling about 10 to 20 watts more on average. The Ryzen 5000 CPUs can be more efficient than these charts show. Remember that they have PBO2 enabled, which pushes more towards performance than efficiency. Also, I have updated my 12900K power draw numbers, which is why they're a bit different from my launch review. The 12600K DDR4 MCE results, though, are just kind of silly here and are right up there with the 12900K's performance. So if you do run this setup, you'll want to tune the OC settings a bit by at least lowering the voltage to keep temps and power draw in check. And now for the benchmarks, starting with Cinebench R23, and there's a couple things to keep in mind for all of these. DDR4 will provide better latency, but DDR5 will provide more bandwidth, and each test might do better with one or the other. With the DDR4 MCE setup, we scored 18,865 points for the 12600K, a 10% bump up from stock, so at least that extra power and heat isn't just going to waste. DDR5 didn't provide any boost though, but all 3 configurations well outperformed the 5800X. Here's the single-thread Cinebench R23 test, and the 12600K scored about 1850 at stock, 14% better than a Ryzen 5900X. The MCE overclock with DDR4 provided a 4% bump here, although it wasn't enough to pass up the 12900K, which scored 2010. Next is CPU Mark 10.1, which is part of the Passmark Performance Test Suite and runs a series of workloads including integer math, compression, physics, and encryption to determine overall performance. CPU Mark seems to prefer the DDR4 setups, as both surpassed DDR5 here, with the DDR4 plus MCE score topping 31,000, which allowed it to beat out the 5800X again, although the other 12600K configurations couldn't quite make it that far. The CPU Mark single-threaded test again shows off the 12600K's lead over all the AMD chips, as well as the 10th and 11th gen Intel flagships, scoring about 4,000 points or more, and only getting beaten out by the 12900K. Blender is next, a free and open source 3D creation suite for modeling, animation, simulation, and rendering. We're using the Open Data tool to run the standard suite of 5 tests and showing elapsed time to complete the run, so faster is better. The 12600K makes the 10900K and 11900K look silly with similar performance despite a core and thread count deficit, and the DDR4 plus MCE result shaves about 100 seconds off the stock score too. We're again ahead of the 5800X with all 3 setups, although the 12600K still can't quite keep up with the higher higher core count AMD chips like the 5900X and 5950X. Next, we have a video transcoding via handbrake using a 4-minute 39-second 4K 150 megabits per second H.264 10-bit video as a source and transcoding it to 1080p with the fast preset. The encoding speed is shown as a frame rate, and at 42 to 45 frames rendered per second, the 12600K again beats out the previous Intel flagships as well as the 5600X and 5800X. We have a couple entries from the Adobe suite next, starting with Photoshop, and I'm testing the 2021 versions with the Puget Systems benchmark extension. The 12600K did very well here, scoring between 1177 and 1246 points, essentially besting every Ryzen chip tested and making the 10900K and 11900K look even more silly. Here's Adobe Premiere Pro 2021, also testing with the Puget Systems benchmark extension, and this time the higher core count Ryzen CPUs give a better showing. The 5800X comes within spitting distance of all three 12600K entries, and the 5950X and 5900X still show that they're more than capable when it comes to this particular variety of video editing software. Moving on, we have the new version of V-Ray 5.02, which is a software solution by Chaos Group that helps artists and designers create photoreal imagery and animation for design, television, and feature films. The benchmark provides a result in V-samples, and here again the 12600K is hanging out with the 5800X, while still falling well short of the 5900X or 5950X, which is to be expected. The 12900K extended a healthy 62% lead over the stock 12600K as well. The Corona renderer is a modern high-performance photorealistic renderer available standalone or as a plugin for 3D Studio Max or Cinema 4D, and again we're looking at time to render, so lower is better. While the 5950X dominates this test with its 16 cores and 32 threads, the 12600K still hangs tough with the 5800X. 7-zip tests one of the more common tasks you can do with a computer, basic file compression and decompression using the 32 megabyte dictionary size setting. In the compression test, I discovered something that other reviewers have already documented. 7-zip compression really likes DDR5's bandwidth boost, with that setup outperforming stock DDR4 by 18.6%. For decompression, the DDR5 advantage goes away, and all three configurations have similar scores, with the DDR4 MCE setup gaining an 8% lead. This is also a test where the Ryzen CPUs do better, with the 5800X winning versus all 12600K setups, and the 5600X getting uncomfortably close as well. Now let's check out a handful of gaming benchmarks and see if the 12600Ks can keep up with the 12900K and the Ryzens. I'm running all the games except 3D Mark at 1080p, a relatively lower resolution where CPU performance will make more of a difference in the frame rates we achieve, and we're running a stock RTX 3090 Founders Edition GPU. 3D Mark Times by Extreme is a synthetic benchmark from 3D Mark. It's a DirectX 12 test, and here the 3090's graphics score did not vary much between CPUs because it's at a higher resolution and therefore more GPU bound. When CPU limitations aren't a factor, usually at higher resolutions like 4K, you should get performance like this, within a couple percentage points. That said, there's also a CPU-only test in this benchmark, and here the 12600K topped the 5800X again, while falling short of beating the 10900K or 11900K. Meanwhile, Shadow of the Tomb Raider is running in DirectX 12 mode and showing some interesting results. The 12900K is on top, but the Ryzen 7 and Ryzen 9s are close behind, and with AMD also maintaining a lead over the 12600K, which is more in line with the 5600X here. Total War 3 Kingdoms is also using DirectX 12, and we're running the Dynasty mode benchmark. Performance results are all within about 5 FPS of each other here, however, or 1 to 2%, although the AMD CPUs are showing slightly better 1% low numbers. Here's a look at Civilization 6 performance using the Gathering Storm AI benchmark, where CPU capabilities are determined by AI turn time rather than how many frames it can squeeze out of a GPU, so again, lower is better. This is one of the better tests for the 12600K, with it only really losing to the 12900K, and the MCE results getting about a 4 to 5% bump over stock. Rounding things out with Far Cry 6, and again we're seeing the advantages that the additional 200 MHz or so clock speed on the 12900K brings, allowing it to stand out as the clear winner, while the 12600K is still stuck in the middle of the pack with the Ryzen 7 and Ryzen 9s. And that's all for the compute and gaming benchmarks, so let's sum up the performance. Here are my aggregate scores across all tests, starting with compute performance. I'm showing gaming performance here too for comparison, but sorting by compute. I'm using the 5900X as the 100% baseline, and based on my tests in terms of compute power, the 12600K clearly has a leg up over the 5800X, as well as the 10900K and 11900K. If we resort by gaming, the differences are smaller, and I again want to reiterate that this was a limited number of tests, but what I found surprising was the wash between DDR4 and DDR5 performance in the 12600K. You'll also get a decent 5% upgrade versus the 5600X based on my numbers, but the higher core count CPUs, apart from the 12900K, maintain similar gaming performance. Here's a final chart with CPU pricing as well, because it helps to have it all on one page. And please note that this is not the total platform cost as I discussed at the beginning of this video, which is a big factor, especially if you intend to go the DDR5 route. Also, AMD CPU pricing has been weird, with the 5800X selling for as little as $300 at Micro Center right after launch, which has since gone back up to $330, but it's still going for $380 to $390 at online retailers like Amazon and Newegg. Now that's definitely a better deal than the 5600X, which went up to $310, but is now back to $300, which is no longer a competitive price at all, and I hope AMD does an official MSRP drop on that one, because the 5800X is a better competitor for the 12600K. We'll have to wait and see. Finally, I did have some time to do some overclocking, so first off I went into the BIOS and I noticed there were a few presets on this Gigabyte motherboard, so I tried the max performance profile first, which said +3, which I assumed was going to do a 300 MHz overclock. However, when I got into the operating system, I found it was just running all the P cores at 4.6 GHz, all the E cores at 3.7 GHz. Voltage was about 1.2 to 1.21, so it wasn't really much of an overclock. It did up the power limit a bit, resulting in about 141 watt draw from the CPU package, and the Cinebench R23 score was 17645, which is a little bit up from stock. Next, I tried the gaming profile, which said it was a +1 BIOS preset, which I thought was going to do a 100 MHz overclock, but this is actually the function that disables the E cores. So in the operating system, all I was seeing was P cores, not E cores, so I had a 6-core, 12-thread setup. It was running at 4.9 GHz across all cores, a little bit higher voltage at 1.24 to 1.25, and again a little bit higher power draw than stock at about 140 watts. However, without the E cores, our Cinebench R23 score did drop to 14,886. So I decided to do a really quick manual overclock in the BIOS, and again, this was really quick. All I was doing was XMP settings. I turned MCE off, so it wasn't going to be messing with my CPU frequencies at all. I did a +0.015 volt CPU V-core offset, and I set the P cores to run at 5.1 GHz on 1 to 2 cores, 5 GHz on 3 to 6 cores, and the E cores to 4 GHz for all cores. Then while testing with Cinebench, the V core was at 1.36. The temperatures were definitely higher, about 70 to 75 degrees C on average, hitting 90 C max, and the wattage on the package was definitely up to 208 watts. However, we did get a higher Cinebench R23 multi-thread score of 19,181. From there, I did one more quick tweak because I wanted to see if I could hit 5.2 GHz like the 12900K does on 1 or 2 cores. So I did 5.2 GHz on a single core, 5.1 GHz on 2 cores, and then 5 GHz across all cores, and with just a little bit more CPU voltage bumping up the offset to +0.02. This resulted in roughly the same voltage and temperatures while testing, about 1.36 to 1.37 on the V core, 70 to 75 degrees average temperature, 90 C max, and the most package power draw at 210 watts. However, again, we got another bump to our Cinebench score at 19,278. So here's a chart with all of those overclocked numbers with Cinebench multi-thread on there, so you can see how they stack up in relation to the other CPUs I was testing today. And then I also did the single thread test with these overclock settings, in particular 5.2 GHz on the single core, and we got very, very close to the 12900K, hitting 1970 for Cinebench R23 single core. That's only 40 points shy of the 12900K with MCE enabled, showing that you can get very similar single thread performance with a little bit of an overclock on the 12600K. So to sum up, if you're on the hunt for new core components for your gaming PC right now, you have more and better choices than you did a few weeks ago, and Intel is definitely a viable option. I'd love to see lower priced Z690 boards or a B660 chipset that can actually do a bit of overclocking, but at least there's a $200-ish option that can handle a 12600K just as well as one of those silly $500 plus Z690 boards. Also, DDR4 is still totally viable, and it won't even really hurt your performance unless all you do is compress 7 zip files, so feel free to save some cash as long as you bear in mind that a future DDR5 switchover will require you to buy a new motherboard. I really hope you guys have enjoyed this video though. I will put very important links to click down in the description, and if you have comments, I would be interested to read them, so let me know if you thought this comparison would play out differently. Is anyone ready to take the plunge and set up an LGA 1700 system with Intel's 12th gen processors? Subscribe to my channel as well if you haven't already. Check out my store at paulshardware.net for shirts and pint glasses and other cool stuff that you can buy. Hit the thumbs up button on your way out if you enjoyed this video, because it was a lot of work, and we'll see you in the next one.